Hey, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Good to have you here as always. So tonight's video is about something pretty dark in New Zealand's history. It's a story not many want to talk about, but it's important to understand how such a quiet, small country like New Zealand became, well, a hotbed for white nationalism, skinhead gangs, and violent racist movements. I want to take you through the history of the various white power groups, skinhead gangs, and neo-Nazi movements that have existed there. I'll keep it straightforward, no deep dives into each one, but enough to get a clear picture of the scale and the unique way New Zealand became, quite frankly, a cesspit of racist gang culture. So this is a story that's very specific to this country. I've never seen anywhere else have such a disproportionate number of these groups. Considering how small our population is, it's unlike Australia, the US, or Europe, where these movements are more obviously tied to political agendas. So buckle up, this is new Naziland. New Zealand for a long time has had this underground scene of racist and white supremacist groups that grew mostly from the late 70s through to the 90s and even into the 2000s. But unlike other countries where these groups usually had clearer political wings or goals, like marching, protests, or forming political parties, here is mostly about gang culture and violence. Our gang culture in New Zealand has always been about loyalty and sticking to your own. In a very twisted way, the Nazis and the skinhead formed their own version of that family. But it was often less about ideology and more about survival and aggression. And violence was a currency and fear was a tool. The gangs were often fragmented with many small crews and groups of splintering off and sometimes merging, but all sharing a violent reputation and racist beliefs, or at least racist imagery. So here's a rundown of the white power groups and skinhead gangs that have existed there, with a little bit of info on some of the bigger or better known ones. So Hammerskins, probably one of the most infamous. New Zealand had one official chapter based in Wellington and an unofficial one in Christchurch. They were part of the International Hammerskin Nation, a violent neo-Nazi skinhead group with roots in the US but global reach. You have Chaos Skins. They are a skinhead group linked closely to prison gangs in the North Island. They were less politically motivated and more about controlling turf and prison dominance, but with the same racist undercurrent. Then you had the Droogs. Droogs was a skinhead gang that had a reputation for street-level violence and racist attacks. You had the Bandenkrieg. Bandenkrieg are essentially a feeder gang for the Road Knights MC. Bandenkrieg was made up of younger skinheads being groomed to join an MC, which later adopted a racist agenda. And you had the right-wing resistance. The name alone sounds laughable, but they were a real skinhead gang formed around white supremacist ideology. They pushed Nazi imagery hard, but were mostly involved in street fighting rather than politics. Then you had New Zealand National Front, run for decades, fronted by Colin King Ansell, later by Kyle Chapman, attempted political legitimacy but also connected to skinhead violence. You had the National Socialist Party in New Zealand, literal Nazis, starting in the late 60s. You had the New Zealand League of Rights, anti-Semitic conspiracy heavy, active through the 70s to the early 2000s. Then you had groups like White Defence League, New Order, and the European Liberation Front, various groups mostly active in the South Island during the 70s and 80s. And you had New Force and National Democrats Party, splinter nationalist parties from the 80s onwards associated with Kerry Bolton. Then there was Patriot Party, briefly active around 2005. And then the Dominion Movement, youth-focused identitarian-style nationalism, active in the late 2010s. And then Action Zealandia, formed after the Christchurch terror attacks, still active but mostly online. Then Vargas Christi, a neo-Nazi cult. Black Order, esoteric Nazi group with a limited presence. You also had Blood and Honour in New Zealand, which was kind of formed by the Australian chapter. Blood and Honour is a neo-Nazi music and skinhead network that spread into New Zealand. They focused mainly on spreading white power music and culture. Then you had Crew 38. Now, the Crew 38 was formed by the Hammerskins in Wellington. Now, Crew 38 are just a feeder club for the Hammerskins. And then some of the older ones like Papanui Skins, which was originally just a skinhead group who later on became racist and violent. They tended to die out in the late 80s, early 90s. And Southern Skinheads, we don't know too much about them, but they were active in Christchurch and Invercargill. And then, of course, you had the Harris Brothers, known as a racist violent gang, sometimes known as the Harris Republic Army, or HRA. And then Fourth Reich, one of the most notorious white power gangs in New Zealand, known for violence, Nazi symbolism. Their founder, Trevor Clark, later joined United Front, showing the fluid nature of these groups. Also noted that Trevor Clark was also half Samoan. Then you had Unit 88, which is based in Auckland and formed by Colin Ansell, one of the most public faces of New Zealand's white supremacist movement. Ansell was involved in the multiple groups and helped push the racist skinhead scene. And then you had a couple of MCs, Satan's Slaves MC, which started as a non-racist motorcycle club, but later became aligned with white power skinheads as new members joined with racist agendas. Interestingly, the founder was actually Taika Waititi's father. Yeah, a strange footnote giving Waititi's current fame and his pride in his Māori heritage. And then you had the Road Knights MC. Now, originally not explicitly racist, but became so over the years as new racist skinhead members joined the ranks. And there's a few more groups worth mentioning. United Front. Now, this group had members who migrated from other gangs, including Trevor Clark from Fourth Reich. And then you had the United Nazi Skinheads, or it's also called United Skins, another skinhead group focused on white power and Nazi ideology, with notable members Glenn and Craig McAllister. Then you had smaller groups like Ruthless Boot Boys, who were just a Christchurch skinhead group that actually had links to the Harris Brothers. So the big question is, why did New Zealand have so many of these groups? In the 90s and early 2000s, New Zealand's overall gang culture exploded. It wasn't just about traditional motorcycle clubs that were established big gangs anymore. Youth and street gangs mushroomed in towns and cities across the country. The country was going through tough economic times, and with that came frustration, anger, resentment. That anger was mostly directed at the government and the establishment. But on the streets it boiled over into violence and the need to band together for protection. The ones who felt this most deeply were Māori and Pacifica youth, but with gangs forming around these groups, the white kids who felt threatened or displaced sought their own groups for protection. Many of these groups had adopted racist ideologies as a kind of weapon to empower themselves, to scare others, and to feel like they had some control. So for many, it wasn't about race per se, it was about survival, identity, and defending their turf or community. That's why you also had Māori and Pacifica skinheads who aligned themselves with these racist crews, because they shared the belief of fighting for their own, even if their skin wasn't the same colour. The gang's purpose was protection, family and power, but racism was the banner they flew to intimidate and consolidate strength. Unlike Australia and other countries where skinhead and white power groups have more clear political connections, such as National Alliance linking with Blood and Honour, New Zealand's scene was mostly gang-based and violent rather than political. Kyle and Colin Ansell were exceptions, but they were involved politically. But even then, New Zealand's white power gangs rarely marched or held rallies like elsewhere. Their focus was on street fights, intimidation, and criminal enterprises. So by the early 2010s, these groups were already dwindling. The Christchurch terror attack in 2019 was a brutal reminder of how far these ideologies can go, but it also marked a turning point. Most of these groups had already splintered or shrunk to handfuls of diehards. Right-wing resistance clung on but barely, hanging by a thread, or as some say, by a tattered Reichskrieg flag soaked in misinformation. Today, New Zealand's gang scene has changed. It's more multicultural, with Māori, Pacifica, Pakeha, and others often united in gangs that support their communities, not racist hate groups. The government has taken a zero-tolerance stance. Cases like Philip Tarp's convictions show that racist groups and actions won't be tolerated anymore. Now, the only known white power group trying to pop up now is Action Zealandia, an online activist group that sprang up after the terror attacks but has largely been ineffective. Their activity level moves at the pace of a dead Fuhrer out of a bunker, slow and doomed. So that's the story of white power movements in New Zealand, a country where a small population met a big problem, where gang culture, economic hardship and fractured communities create a fertile ground for racist violence. But it's also a story of change, where the majority of New Zealanders have said enough, where the racist gangs and skinheads that once ruled the streets have been pushed to the margins. There's no place for them there anymore. Thank you so much for tuning in for another week. Really appreciate you being here and listening to this one. Hopefully this one is a fairly complete and, for the most part, accurate, complete list of all the white power movements in New Zealand from the past. And hey, if there's any that I've missed out, please feel free to drop a comment below. But if you would like to see more videos like this, deep dives into many of these subcultures from around the world, interviews with former members, and much more, then hit the subscribe button. You can also hit the like and hit that little bell to get notified of new videos coming out every week. If you'd like to see more and support the channel, there's many different ways you can do that. Membership is one, buying me a coffee is another, but for every other way to support me, all the links are in the description below. Be much appreciated. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen, and I will see you next week for another video. Thanks so much. Peace out, and love and light to you.